So for most of us, whether we're regular churchgoers or not regular churchgoers, this is one of those passages that is really familiar. It's so familiar that sometimes what happens is we stop hearing it. We might listen, but we don't actually really hear. It happens to me too. So this year I spent a little bit of time and I looked at this story in all four of the Gospels. Of course it is in all four of the Gospels. And there's similarities and there's differences, but one common piece in all four Gospels is that Mary Magdalene is there in all four. The angels are there too, but they differ. In John and Luke, there are two angels. In Matthew and Mark, there are only one. In John, we understand that Mary is the only person who saw both the crucifixion and the resurrection. Peter was first into the tomb, of course. He saw that the body was gone. And our story tells us that he believed, although we understand they didn't quite understand what the resurrection was all about, so we weren't sure really what he was believing at that part. But imagine Mary. She has just gone through the worst time of her life. Her Lord, her teacher, her friend just experienced the most horrific death. For 3 days, the disciples spent time fearful, afraid that they would be next. Lower than low, she goes on that first Easter morning, and she goes in the dark. And in John, it says it's dark. It's dark. In the other Gospels, they talk about light. But for John, it was dark. And she goes to the tomb, and much to her dismay, the body's gone. And one more thing, could they not just let him rest? One more thing. After all they had been through, they couldn't even honor the dead. They had taken her friend, her Lord. And she's the only one who stays there after realizing that or thinking that at that time. And she stays there and she's crying and she's imagining what could possibly be worse. Can you put yourself in that moment? Dark, dark despair. And Jesus is right there with her. She doesn't know. He's talking to her and she thinks he's the gardener. And then, in that moment, he says, Mary. And in that moment, she knows. In that moment, she hears the voice of her teacher, and she says, Teacher. And in that moment, her life is changed. She moves from her despair. She moves from her grief. In that moment, she is transformed, and God's love conquers all. In just that moment, just by hearing her name, Mary is transformed, and I believe as we listen to this story that this exactly is what Easter is all about. That transformation that takes place through the risen Christ. And John in this story allows us to see ourselves in the story, doesn't he? Like Jim was experiencing in the beginning, we can sometimes see ourselves as Peter, can't we? Sometimes we feel like we're denying Christ more than we're loving Christ or being faithful to Christ. And sometimes, like Mary, we're just so overcome with weeping. We can see ourselves there. We can see this story as our story. And I believe that our stories help us understand and shape our world. The Easter story gives us an opportunity to reflect on that. When we think about our own stories, what does it look like? Is your story a New York Times bestseller? Or maybe it's not. And today is a day to consider our own stories. You see, they say that a good author or a good writer has a real ability to bring someone into the story. I don't know about you, but reading stories to my children was one of the things I love to do the most. Maybe it is because I wasn't so great at playing. I'd get really bored with the Barbies and the other games, but I could read and read for hours. And to this day, I love to read to children. And even more so, I love to be read to. I love to hear a good story, don't you guys? Who doesn't love a good story? And this is one of the best stories we could ever imagine. The story of Easter is a love story. The story of Easter is a time where we see goodness over bad. It's a time where evil does not get the last word. This is an amazing story of God's love for us. We move from that place of sadness, loneliness, despair, and we move to hope. We move to the good news, and that's what today is all about. This is really, really good news. And so what are we going to do with it? What are we going to do with this good news for our stories? Because we can come and we can listen to the music, because Easter, there's so much great music at Easter, and we can look at the beautiful lilies and the cute kids and their flowers that they were mangling on their way back to their moms. And I mean, that's really awesome stuff, right? And we have probably hams to look forward to this afternoon, or maybe a brunch somewhere. And that's all good for today. Good memories made for today. But the lasting opportunity we have is to look at our story, see ourselves in the Easter story, and decide what might need a transformation in our own lives. Maybe our story is it is a New York Times bestseller. And maybe we need to share that out, spread some love around. Or maybe when we look at our stories, might not be a story we want to tell. Or it might not be a story that would keep the attention of those we love. And maybe, just maybe, we can do a little better. And if we can take a few minutes today to contemplate our story, and to think about how we can move from this place transformed, then I'd say, outside of the ham and the delicious breakfast and the lilies and the music, we've had a pretty darn awesome Easter. And that is my prayer for each one of us. May it be so. God bless you.